Hello again, and welcome to the 12th of our lectures in this series on the foundations of Western civilization. We've been talking about the public cultures of the polis, and today we turn to one of the most durable of all the Greek inventions, of all the inventions of that remarkable institution, the polis, and this is philosophy, the love of wisdom. The philosopher is one who loves wisdom. Now, the Greeks invented philosophy as a formal intellectual discipline with its own rules, with its own system, with its own way of asking questions and of answering questions. This is a process that began to emerge, as we'll see, about 600 BC over in Ionia. It has persisted until this morning. It has not stopped. Now, we ought to clear up one or two possible misconceptions. If I say the Greeks invented philosophy, do I mean to imply by that that no one before the Greeks had thought seriously about anything? Do I mean to say that people before the Greeks had not amassed large amounts of information? No, of course not. That would be absurd. There is a difference between what the Greeks themselves had done in early times and continued to do, and what other people did, and philosophy. That's the crucial point. Now, generally speaking, before the Greeks, amongst other peoples in other words, and even among the early Greeks, what we would think of later as philosophical explanations worked at the level of religion and worked at the level of what we would call cosmological explanations. Cosmos means, in a sense, everything, the ordering and arrangement of everything. Cosmology is the study of the origins and arrangement of everything. A poet, slightly younger than Homer, for example, whose name was Hesiod, wrote a book called The Theogony, in which he attempted to explain how everything got here. And this was attributed to wars and battles and contests among generations of the gods and goddesses way back at the mists of time. Now, there's a very interesting comparison we could draw, for instance, with the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, where we also have a very detailed account of creation. But not there because of quarrels among the gods, but because a god had a particular purpose in mind and arranged things for a reason, arranged things, as it were, with meaning. So the Greeks had cosmological explanations, as Mesopotamians did, as Egyptians did. They attributed the origins of everything to something or other that the gods had done that was more or less understandable and that happened a long time ago. Slowly but surely, the Greeks began to recognize that all of these answers were contradictory, that all of these answers were different, and that many of these answers seemed to contradict plain common sense. Surely the world is not as these poems describe it. Now you may say, well, what about the Olympian deities? What about the familiar deities of the Greek world? Do they play some role in this process? The Olympian deities, that is to say, Zeus and Hera and so on, the great gods and goddesses who were thought to live on Mount Olympus. The Greeks, generally speaking, did not turn to their Olympian deities for understandings of how their world got here, of what their world was. They would turn to those deities, and they did this, for example, in Homer's Iliad, and they did this in Greek drama after Greek drama after Greek drama, and in other poetic works too, as a way of explaining how societies work, how human emotions work, how human feelings work, how we are motivated to behave as we are. But there's an interesting problem we face in connection with the Greek deities. We can certainly read Greek literature and say that we know how the Greeks talked about their gods, and we can be pretty confident that we know that in talking about their gods, the Greeks were talking about themselves. The deities were, in a certain sense, a great screen on which the Greeks projected themselves so they could watch themselves. But those deities were not asked to explain the origins of everything, what underlay everything. That is the turn the Greeks made. That is a parting of the ways from religious explanations for things. That is at the dawn of Greek philosophy. Did Greeks, once they began inventing philosophy, cease being religious? Well, I dare say those people in Athens, about whom we spoke in one of our earlier lectures, who built the Parthenon, who built the temple to Athena Parthenos, were not people who had abandoned religion. But religion played different roles for the Greeks, than it would subsequently for them, and that it had already and would continue to have for other people. Now, if philosophy means the development of a formal intellectual discipline, what do I have in mind by that? I have in mind basically the elaboration of three very basic questions. It was in posing these questions, in elaborating these questions, that the Greeks took this step of inventing what we call philosophy. First question, what is the world made of? What is the world made of? Now, slowly but surely, as the Greeks thought about that, and I think we'll see this as we go along, they were working in a realm much closer to what we would think of as natural science. All right? And we'll ask something about why they would have started there, and how then, slowly but surely, natural science may eventually part ways from philosophy in the strict sense. In the second place, how can we know? What is the nature of knowing? Now, we can put a fancy name on that. That's epistemology, the science of knowing. What does it mean to know? If I say I know something, what does that mean? How do we know? Finally, third question, what should we do? How should we behave? We can turn philosophy towards ourselves, and we can elaborate ethics and morals. So, philosophy asks questions about that world out there, it asks questions about how we know, and it asks questions about what we ought to do. It is in the elaboration of formal questioning and formal answering like that that Greek philosophy is born. And this is something that, at least in that form, does rise in Greece. Now, the quest for wisdom, the Greeks always drew a distinction between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is the accumulation of information. Knowledge is the accumulation of facts and details. Wisdom is a way of thinking that stands behind this, that informs this, that is basic to this. What we really want in the end is wisdom. What we really want in the end is wisdom. Now, this is a bit like saying, how many of us have friends who are enormously intelligent people and sort of have no common sense? We might say, well, very smart, but not very wise, you see? Now, that's a rather crude way of putting the same point, but it's as if some people can be very, very well informed, and yet there's something lacking just a little bit in sort of how they go about their business. All right. Well, when Aristotle talked about the rise of the quest for wisdom, he, and most of those who have followed him, said we must start in Ionia. We must start among the Ionian Greeks, the Greeks who lived over on the Aegean coast of Anatolia. Now, this was a world that was open to Persia. As we've seen in earlier lectures, it had been conquered by the Persians. It rebelled against the Persians. Intellectual traditions passed back and forth very easily in that part of the world. It meant that this was an area which, through the Persians, was open to Mesopotamian learning earlier. There were great commercial cities in Ionia. People from Ionia traveled all over the Greek world, all over the Mediterranean world. So, even if we can't trace specific ideas as having come from this person or this place at that moment to another person or another place at another moment, it's a reasonable inference that Ionia was a very lively intellectual environment. And there, about the year 600, a man called Thales gets our story started for us. He began to ask questions about how things had come into existence. How did things come into being? Then he began to reflect a little bit on sort of what's out there. If I look out through my eyes, what do I see? What is all of that? He decided that a way of explaining this was to say that water was behind everything. Now, did he mean that everything is made of water, or that everything had started as water and sort of became something else? That's not so clear. What is clear is that he was trying to find something that subsists, something that is behind everything, something that is permanent, something that is unchanging, something in a way that is the hook on which you can hang things. Now, to this day, if a scientist is to conduct an experiment, you've got to control something in order to measure other things against it. Now, at the most sophisticated levels of science and mathematics, we're now learning how actually to control several things at once and compare several things against them. But in a simpler time, you control one thing and you measure other things against it. In a certain sense, that's what Thales was intuiting. You got to get something that stays put so that you can understand other things in relation to it. Now, some of Thales' successors posed other materialist answers. We say materialist not because we're speaking of Marxian materialism. That's not the point. They were looking for materials. Thales had posed water as this substance. Others, in asking questions about what is the world made of, posed different answers. For example, one of them says earth, air, fire, and water. Now, Remember when we talked about Mesopotamian religion? We said that even if some of the answers that they gave, some of the conclusions they reached strike us as primitive, strike us as naive, there was something interesting about it in the way that they were trying to systematize the world out there and to put names on things and to make sense of it. Let's think about that earth, air, fire, and water. Remember, this is at the level of sheer intuition. These thinkers are not working in great laboratories financed by companies or universities or something. If we imagine fire as a catalyst, well, earth, air, and water just about do cover everything, don't they? I mean, he'd almost intuited actually how things do work. Think of these things as a kind of a periodic chart of the elements in embryo. And there's a remarkable piece of intuition here. Now, another said fire. In other words, looked basically for the catalytic element, the element that forces things to move, forces things to change. They began to realize that one of the interesting problems they were going to contend with was change. How do you cope with the problem of change? What is change? Well, Parmenides, who really flourished as as Pericles was coming on the scene in Athens, said that being, this substance that we're looking for, must be one, motionless, uniform, and eternal. Now, what that really represents is an attempt to add definition, to add substance, to add meaning to the very intuitive processes that had begun with Thales. We're really trying to give a little more precision to whatever this thing is that we're going to try to pin down in order to understand other things in relation to it. So being must be one, motionless, uniform, and eternal. Now, on this view, change was illusory. Change didn't really take place. Now, in a certain sense, and this is an issue we'll tease out in several different ways over the next few minutes, but right away what we can say is that Parmenides is actually answering one of his contemporaries, one of his earlier predecessors, a man with the name of Heraclitus. Heraclitus' motto was Pantare, everything flows. He's the one who said you can't stick your foot in the same river twice, because you stick your foot in the river and you withdraw your foot and you stick your foot in again, the river has flowed on, you've stuck your foot in a new river. Well, he didn't really believe that, but he was making a rather interesting point, that everything changes. For Heraclitus, change was that which was immutable. Paradoxically, the mutable was the immutable. Well, there's a couple of interesting points hiding there. We see that Parmenides responds, no. He's going to give a material answer again, but we've got to have something that is one and motionless and eternal and so on. The other thing is that we are beginning to see thinkers move a step or two past the idea that there will be material explanations for things. Because with Heraclitus, we've really got a different kind of answer. If change is the one unchanging thing, that's a very different thing from saying earth or air or fire or water, you see? It's a very different kind of answer. The question's the same, the aim is the same, what you're trying to figure out is the same, but it's a different kind of answer. Now, it was at that point that a thinker called Anaxagoras comes along and says, actually, mind is crucial. Mind is crucial. What did that mean? What he meant by that was things exist to the degree, and only to the degree, that they are perceived. Now, you've all heard, perhaps not without thinking about it, or perhaps without thinking about it, examples of this. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Anaxagoras would say, no, because the sound must be perceived. For things to exist, they must be perceived. Now, do you notice this is another interesting step from pure materialism through beginnings of conceptual attempts to grapple with the material, now to the grappling tool itself, the mind. So now we are moving back and forth, in a sense, along a spectrum from the world that is out there and from the active intelligence that is in here. And we're beginning to understand that the processes of thought, the nature of thought, how thought works, is going to be crucial. Now, in a number of important ways, Greek thinking on being, now you imagine that word with a capital B, being, the state of existence. What bees? We don't have that word. But we said, what bees out there? What is the nature of being? The Greeks basically put that question, more or less, on the platform where it's resided ever since. Now, we have qualified it in a variety of ways, and we've approached it in a variety of ways. Subsequent Greek thought will, in a sense, here begin to part paths. The path that followed natural science will explore being in greater and greater and greater detail as an objective understanding of that world out there. Philosophy is going to travel on a different path. It's going to spend more time thinking about thinking. It's going to spend more time thinking about getting in touch with that world out there. And then slowly but surely, and under circumstances that we'll come to in just a few minutes, philosophy began to turn to what we would call ethics and morals. All right. That being the case, how do we know? Let's go back to that question, our second question. How do we know? As thinkers reflected on being, they recognized that our senses, in the first instance, are the tools that we have. All right. So if we are going to ask, how do we know? And if we are going to cope with the tools that are at our disposal for knowing, we're going to pose an agenda of questions. Let's say 4. What does it mean to know? What does that mean? What's the nature of that process? Can we actually know anything? Is knowledge possible? What means are available to us for knowing? How is the world constituted? And how am I constituted so that I can know something about that world out there? Am I composed in such a way that I actually have some capability of understanding that world out there? Now, initially, knowledge was equated very much with what I have seen myself. You'll remember perhaps when we were talking about Herodotus, the Greek historian. We said that among other things, he said, you can write about what you have seen. You can write about what you know yourself. So he traveled enormously and he interrogated large numbers of people. We saw, for example, among the Greek medical writers, who were so influential, for instance, on Thucydides, that close study and observation were crucial. Now, if we extend our thought just a bit, what I have seen, we're talking about one of our senses, aren't we? The sense of sight. Eventually, people began to recognize that we have 4 more senses. Taste, touch, sound, hearing, and smell. So we have 5 tools, in a sense, at our disposal to get in touch with that world out there. But is sense perception a valid or a sound basis for knowing things? Our senses began to evoke, among the Greeks, very severe criticisms. Is there an objective reality that can be attached to senses? Or are senses utterly subjective? If, for example, I listen to a piece of music and find it pleasing, well, that's an interesting problem right away. What does that statement mean? I was pleased. How do we understand that? Well, let's suppose for the moment that's not problematic, and we really basically know what I just said. But perhaps you will be pleased by a different piece of music. Now, how has the sense of sound communicated valid and replicable information? I like asparagus. I don't know if you do. Lots of people don't. Does asparagus taste good or taste bad? If I say asparagus tastes wonderful, but you don't like asparagus, have I actually communicated anything to you? Have I told you anything? Do you now know something? Well, you might say, yes, I know that you like asparagus. So we've posed the problem in a sense of second-hand knowledge. Suppose a blind person, and you tell the blind person the sky is blue. Now, the blind person knows for sure that you have told him or her that the sky is blue. The blind person may think you're a reliable person and they ought to believe you and you're generally credible and so on. But does that person actually know something, or do they know what you told them? How much of what we know is at second or at third or at fourth hand? And is not personal observation, and is not in any meaningful sense objective, but in fact subjective. So does all knowledge exist only in relation to me? can only I know things, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you, but that we don't know things? That's an interesting problem. Now, with the critique of the senses, there began to arise a critique of language. Let's suppose for a moment there are things to be known. Let's suppose for a moment that knowing them, getting in touch with them, is unproblematic. Clearly it is. But let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that these are not problems. Now I have the problem of communicating what I know. I have one tool to do this, language. You may say I could communicate in other ways. I could do it with painting. I could do it with music. This is entirely true. And it's entirely true that we can think of those things as language, as tools of communication. But the point here is that they are no less ambiguous, no less difficult, no less complicated than the language that is ordinary words. Imagine a very simple sentence. Dog bites man. That occasions no problem. Now I'll use those exact same three words. Man bites dog. It's only by a trick of syntax, of organization, that I have changed the meaning utterly. But the words are all the same. Do words convey meaning? Or is language a series of artifices that may be designed as much to conceal as to reveal? Is language itself ambiguous and communicates, well, something, but how much? 25%, 50%, 100%? What is the nature of language, and how does it work to communicate what we think we know? So, philosophy has begun posing a series of very interesting puzzles for itself. Now, in the midst of this musing over these answers to the three questions I posed, what's out there, how do we know, what should I do? In southern Italy, think for a moment about Greek colonization, think for a moment about Magna Graecia, the transition of a lot of those Greeks over to southern Italy and to Sicily. And over in that part of the world, there was a thinker who had created a kind of a brotherhood around himself. This was Pythagoras, who flourished in the late 6th century BC. Pythagoras' idea, in a certain way, he's going back to Anaxagoras. He's going back to the idea of mind. He's thinking that the only way we're going to get in touch with the world is to think very long and hard about it. And in thinking about the world, in using mind to comprehend reality, we're going to have to try to keep ourselves to the formulation of law-like principles that always work, that are replicable, that work again and again, that work without subjectivity. So he feels that to gain true knowledge, one must live a life dedicated to intense thought. A couple of examples serve very well to show sort of what Pythagoras was up to and the implications of his thinking. And some of these implications we'll see, we'll encounter again in future lectures. He came upon, for example, the mathematical relationships among sounds. For example, the musical intervals is what this means. If you pluck a string and you pluck another string half as long, it will produce a sound twice as high. Now, one can think of the finest piece of music that any of us enjoys, and it's actually pure physics in action. It could all be described mathematically. There is nothing subjective about this. Now you'll say, wait a minute, the same bit of Chopin, played by one pianist and played by another, will not necessarily sound the same. That's entirely true. But what's happening inside the piano is all physics. Are there some laws that are just woven into the fabric of the universe? And our task is to discover them. And the more of them we discover, the more we will know, and the more we can communicate. Because if I tell you, that plucking strings or setting columns of air of certain mathematical relationships to one another into motion will produce a certain effect, you can go off and test it. You don't have to take it as second-hand knowledge. You don't have to take it on my say-so. You can go check it out. He does the same thing with his famous Pythagorean theorem, though that may have been one of his pupils. C squared equals A squared plus B squared, the rule for figuring out the sides and the hypotenuse of right triangles. Well, if something like that, a fundamental human shape, a triangle, could be expressed mathematically, how many more things, perhaps, could be? And so we come again to our friend Anaxagoras and mind. Material answers are insufficient. Pure ratiocination may help us out. we must somehow try to get above language. And if we can get above the ambiguities of language and the ambiguities of sense perception, we may then be able to communicate reliably. Now, it's at that juncture in Athens, with all of these problems in the air, that a group of thinkers called the Sophists come into place. Now, the Sophists have had a bad reputation. Sophistry has a bad reputation, and perhaps with some justification. One thing very clearly that the Sophists did was turn to practical matters. They turned to this world, the world we live in. Now, the Sophists and sophistry in a way got their bad reputation because they'd actually started out studying language. All right, again, one of these fundamental problems that we've just been dealing with. They start studying language. And they were people who ultimately worked out the rules of what we would call rhetoric. Now, we think of rhetoric today as somebody trying to bamboozle us. Rhetoric is actually a formal way of expressing persuasive speech. Sophists were teachers who, for a fee, would teach you how to speak elegantly, yes, but persuasively. That is the crucial thing. They would teach artful use of language for persuasion. Now, this was important in the Athenian assemblies where people made speeches. It was important in Athenian law courts. Think of Thucydides and all of the speeches that we talked about as being littered through Thucydides' history. We see that the playwrights, for example, Sophocles, pillories the sophists. We see that the comedian Aristophanes pillories the sophists. These were the great issues of the day. These were the great issues of the day. Why? Why? What was so engaging about what these sophists were doing? To understand that, we must turn just briefly to sophistic ethics. The sophists drew a distinction between nomos, which means law, and physis, which means nature. Law, they said, is sheer convention. You and I make a deal, we can change the deal. You and I make a deal, somebody else can tempt either of us to make a different deal with them. We do this according to our own convenience. Physis, in the natural order of things, justice works this way. The race is to the swift. The battle is to the strong. Asking whether that is right or whether that is good is utterly meaningless. Beside the point. That's the way the world works. Since, the Sophists held, society's rules are not eternal, they are not immutable, they are not universal, they are mere conventions, they are subject to change at any time we wish. Let's pause for just a moment. Remember Antigone? When we talked about the play and what Sophocles has held out, does she answer the eternal truth of the rules of the gods, and that's a literary convention, not a religious one, fundamentally, or does she obey Creon, who has made these rules, who may make different ones? Well, there's no question where Sophocles comes down on that, you see. But this is one of the ways that these kinds of issues were played out before the Athenian public. All right, so we can make rules, we can change them, we can flaunt them, we can chuck them around, we can tease them out. Nothing is finally right, nothing is finally wrong. Nothing is absolute. This quest for truth is foolish. This quest for ultimate reality is foolish. Man is the measure of all things. That means me. I'm the measure of all things. I measure everything in relation to me. The aim is not to be right, but to prevail. If I go in a court of law, I'm not interested in justice. I want to win. Justice is another issue entirely. That's for theologians and philosophers to worry about. Gorgias posed the hermeneutic paradox. Nothing exists. If anything existed, I couldn't know it. Even if I could know it, I couldn't communicate it. Everything is relative. Everything is relative to me. It's at that juncture that Socrates appears. Socrates wants to vindicate reality. There is something out there. It really exists. He wants to vindicate our capacity to know. And he wants to vindicate our capacity to communicate what we know. But the Sophists had left an indelible mark. They had in a certain way handed Socrates his agenda. Now we'll see at the beginning of our next lecture that Socrates attempts to answer these questions partly in the context of the Athens in which he lived and partly through his pupil Plato and Plato's pupil Aristotle moved philosophy off the dangerous promontory on which the sophists had left it. But the durable contribution of the sophists was to have forced us to ask these nasty questions about the eternal and the momentary, the true and the seeming, justice and prevailing. We've been forced ever since to formulate our questions in that way. How the Greeks answered those questions in the 4th century BC, we'll see in our next lecture.